Hey everybody, welcome back to Chapter 9 Aplia Homework. So today we're going to look back at consumer surplus and producer surplus concepts that we had in earlier chapters. So when we look at the welfare effects of a tariff in a small country. Now first of all, the fact that it's a small country is really important because we're assuming that Guatemala can buy as much as they want on the international market and they will never change the price of whatever it is we're importing here. So their demand is completely irrelevant to the market as a whole. They are very, very, very small. So we don't see any change in the world price when Guatemala changes their demand for, this is corn, maize. So initially the world price is $350 per ton. That means Guatemala can import as much as they want for that price. And it also means that Guatemalan producers of corn can only sell for $350 per ton. They can't ask more than that, because if they ask more than that, then their customers in Guatemala will immediately buy imported corn. So that's relatively important to remember too, that the producers in Guatemala are also just facing the world price. So they can't change, they can't do anything to affect the local price. So when we look at consumer surplus, consumers are willing to pay significantly more than they're paying. So the green area, the part that I've made green there, shows you the area that consumers are willing to pay, but they only have to pay $350. So that very first consumer has to pay $350 per ton. They were willing to pay $710 per ton, so they had a pretty hefty consumer surplus. The next person over is willing to pay a little bit less. Where's my marker? There we go. Sorry, I had to learn how to use this software again. So the next person is willing to pay a little bit less, but again, they only have to pay $350. So this area, this green area, is the amount that consumers would have been willing to pay over that $350 price. Now, on the producer side, some of our producers in Guatemala could produce for less than $350. In fact, the least expensive producer in Guatemala could have been producing at $310, and so would have been willing to sell at $310, but they are facing that international price also, so they can sell for $350. So our producer surplus is this little itty-bitty purple area down here. So what happens if we put a tariff? So we're going to show the effect of an $80 tariff on the graph itself. So what that means is that now corn in Guatemala is going to sell for $350 the world price plus the $80 tariff. So $350 plus 80 gets us to $430, and that's what each and every Guatemalan now has to pay for a ton of maize. So on the good side, we have the producers. So the local producers are now not facing a competitive price of $350. They're facing a competitive price of $430. So the local price of locally produced maize immediately increases to $430. So our producer surplus goes up. On the other hand, our consumer surplus goes down. So we have two effects here. We're going to lose some consumers from the market. So originally consumers were out here buying 18,000 tons of maize. They're not willing to buy that much at $430. So at $430, our equilibrium output drops to, or purchasing, try that again, drops to 14,000 tons of maize. So now in Guatemala we're buying 14,000 tons of maize. We're willing to pay, these consumers are all willing to pay a little bit more than that. So here's our consumer surplus, but it's gone down, right? It used to include this area down here. It no longer does. It's a smaller area. On the other hand, we have some government revenue. So the government is charging, remember that extra $80 per ton is not going to the producers that live outside of Guatemala. Now the producers that live inside Guatemala are getting that. But the producers that live outside of Guatemala are not getting that. The government of Guatemala is getting that. So the government of Guatemala is getting $80 a ton times the number of imported tons. Well, our local producers are now producing 6,000 tons of maize. We're purchasing 14,000 tons of maize. So our So the government is getting the difference there, 14 minus 6, or 8,000 tons of maize, times $80, which is the tariff. So the government is coming out ahead. The local producers are coming out ahead. Who's lost? The people that have lost are clearly our consumers, because we've got these consumers in this little triangle over here who are no longer purchasing maize at all. And then we've got these consumers in this little triangle over here who are continuing to purchase maize, but they're now paying $430 for it instead of $350 for it, so they've lost as well. So our consumers have lost, our local producers have won, our out-of-country producers have lost too, right, because they are no longer selling some maize here in Guatemala. and the government is happy because the government is actually earning a little bit of revenue. So if we do the math that goes with that, the consumer surplus under free trade, actually let me step back and say, all these are triangles, right? So we have to know the formula for the area of a triangle. Formula for area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. So our consumer surplus in the past was the height, that's 710 minus 350, times the base, which was 18, and then 1/2 of that, which if you do that math, it gets you $3,240,000. So let me type that for you guys, just so we get this right for sure. That was 710 minus our price, which was $350, times the base, which was 18, times 0.5, 1/2. And that should add up to $3,240,000. Okay. Producer surplus under free trade was this little tiny area, so it was 350 minus 310, or 40, times 2, which is 80, times 1/2, gets you to 40,000. So 350 minus 310, that's this little bit right here, times 2, that's this little bit right here. They were producing 2,000 tons of maize, times 1/2, because it's a triangle, it's a little triangle, it's not the square. So that gets you the 40,000 right here. On the government side, we do exactly the same thing. The consumer surplus is smaller now. So the consumer surplus is 710 minus 430 times their purchasing less, which is 14, times 1/2. Gets you 1,960,000. Producer surplus is larger, 430 minus 310 times 6 times 1/2 is 360,000. And then we've got government revenue. The government revenue is our tariff, which was 80, right? Times the amount of imports. Now that's 14 minus 6, or 8,000. And that gets you to 640,000. So 80 times 6 times 8,000, 640,000. So as a result of the tariff, Guatemala's consumer surplus decreased by 1.2 million. So that's 3,240,000 minus 1,960,000 gets us 1,280,000. Producer surplus increased by 320,000. That's 360,000 minus 40,000. The government collected $640,000 in revenues. That's this orange triangle here. So the net welfare effect was a loss of 320,000. That's these two kind of brownish gray triangles right here. You can figure out the size of those triangles. Those turn out to be 160,000 each for a net loss of 320,000. So it's a lot of math, but that's what happened when you added a surplus in there. The next question wanted the effect of a tariff on international trade. So here's a graph that shows the domestic supply of and the demand for maize in Burundi. The world price of maize is $255 per ton and is represented by this horizontal black line right here. Now, I don't know why they do these questions. They bother me because the world supply curve is sitting way up here. So the first thing I do, look at these, is change this number right there to 250 because this is really the graph that we're going to be working with at this point. Okay, so suppose Burundi is open to international trade of maize without any restrictions. So here it's going to import 360 minus 40, or 320,000 tons of maize. But our government, for some reason, wants to reduce imports to exactly 80,000 tons of maize. So what that means is they want the difference between supply and demand here to be exactly 80,000. So all I did was stare at the graph for a long time until I found the point where the difference between supply and demand was 80,000. Okay, so that happens to be at 240 and 160. So at 240 and 160, the difference between that is 80,000. So to cap imports at 80,000, we need to charge this price, 330. So what's the tariff? So what tariff do we have to impose to increase the price to 330? Oops. So 330 minus the current price of 255 means we have to impose a tariff of $75 per ton to increase the price to 330. So that's what we did. We imposed a tariff of $70 per ton. Price goes up to 330. Quantity demanded falls to 240. Quantity supplied rises to 160, and we end up with imports of 240 minus 160, or 80,000 tons of maize. So how much revenue does a tariff raise at that price? So at that price, a tariff is going to raise 75 times that the imports of 80, and that gets us revenues of $6 million in tariff revenue for the Burundi government. And last, I wanted to talk briefly about the benefits of free trade. So that's question 5. So we've got a lot of welfare benefits of free trade in an economy. Okay, prices go down, you get lots of other goods in the economy, that kind of thing. So in this scenario, though, Safira has market power as a local producer without free trade. So they can kind of set their price without free trade. But once free trade is implemented in the local economy, they no longer are able to raise their price above competitive levels. They can't do it. They have to price at whatever the world price is. So what happens at that point? The price will fall right down to the world level. So in that scenario, the benefit of free trade that we're talking about, I can almost draw arrows here, is increased competition. So that increased competition is what caused the price to go down. All of these other things are also benefits of free trade, but the one we're talking about in this particular scenario is what happens when you get more competition. In this case, when you get more competition, the price goes down. Alrighty, that is it for the Chapter 9 Aptly homework. So be sure you let me know if you find this useful. Thanks. Bye-bye.